That was Ambassador Peter Galbraith talking to me earlier. Let's get to our panel right now. Should the American press be more critical when it comes to U.S. military conflict and democracy? Joining me in the studio is retired CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Also with us is Sam Sachs. Sam is a reporter and founder of the District Sentinel. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Welcome.
Ray, let me start with you. We just heard that interview there with Peter Galbraith. What do you make of the role in the media and the point that Ambassador Galbraith made, that when we look at coverage of the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, in many instances, reporters are just repeating what they've been told?
There's stenographers, actually. And, you know, the worst is that when you listen to others say that it was a terrible mistake about the intelligence before Iraq, before the invasion of Iraq. Well, I'm sad to say that it wasn't a mistake. It was fraud. It was out-and-out fraud. And my great grief is that my former colleagues fully participated in that fraud. And the fact that no mainstream journalist, except Jonathan Landay, who was working for Knight Ridder at the time, could uncover that fraud is unconscionable. That's what we have now. That's what we have exactly now. There are people being paid big bucks to simply regurgitate what they hear from the State Department, what they hear from the White House.
And I think Mr. Galbraith made a pretty good point when he's talking about embedded reporters. They're there with the soldiers. They develop a camaraderie.
Right.
And it's tough to report critically. And you see that very much here in D.C., even with whether it's Washington Post or New York Times or mainstream cable news outlets. These are the people, they're dining together, the reporters and sources, they're appearing on TV all the time together. So you naturally develop this sort of friendship and you start to view the world in the same sort of way. And there's this consensus thinking in Washington that dominates both parties, really. That is, you know, economically a bit conservative, embracing austerity, socially a bit liberal. But when it comes to foreign policy, very hawkish and militaristic. On the same day that President Trump decided to launch these attacks on a Syrian airfield, we had Hillary Clinton out there calling for these same exact sort of attacks. So what you see when the media fawns over this coverage is the media buying into that same sort of conventional thinking that dominates Washington and is dominating both parties right now.
All right. Ray, there was a great posting by Dan Rather, the former CBS anchor, on Facebook. He said the number of press who have lauded the actions of the U.S. bombing of Syria as presidential is concerning. War, he says, must never be considered a public relations exercise. It is not a way for an administration to gain a narrative.
Well, he should know. He, at one time, several years ago, confessed to explaining why journalists act that way, because they didn't want to be necklaced. Necklace, the allusion to what happened in South Africa, right, very often with burning tires thrown around their neck. I guess to bring this up to today's exercise of the media, they have bought hook, line, and sinker the notion that Bashar al-Assad dropped a chemical weapon on this poor village in Idlib province. It's a lie. We know it's a lie. They know it's a lie. It's just as much a lie as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. What happened was there was this storage facility with chemicals in it. Not chemical weapons, but chemicals that they can put together or make weapons with. The Russians told us in the deconfliction center, our Syrian friends are going to bomb that facility. We know there's some chemicals in there, but we don't know how many. But they're going to bomb that. So we had at least 24 hours, usually 2 to 3 days, to look at all that. We did an assessment, a damage assessment, and our guys said, well, there's probably some in there, but you know, probably not to worry about it. So we had a chance to stop that Syrian flight, and we didn't. When the bomb, it was a GPS-guided bomb, went down into that facility, instead of secondary explosions that you expect to get when you hit an armory or people with weapons in it, we got all this big white smoke come out. The wind was blowing at 20 miles an hour over the village. Now, they know that. McMaster knows that. So does Mad Dog Mattis, okay? And why? Why did they want to do that? Well, 4 days before, Tillerson, the Secretary of State, had said, you know, maybe we ought to let Bashar al-Assad hang around for a while. Nikki Haley at the UN. Yeah, well, our primary objective is not Assad anymore. Oh, wow, now it is, okay? Now, that's pretty cynical, but we know that it happens to be true, and it's not a matter of deception here or mistakes. It's the same as it was with weapons of mass destruction, out and out fraud.
Sam, you know, in terms of conflict, there is this question of patriotism. You know, should the media be patriotic at that time? And it takes all kinds of definitions. George Bush pushed the media into a corner when he said, well, not just to the media, but to everybody, you're either with us or against us. So if you criticize George Bush, then you were against us.
Well, I think the media is generally, mainstream media is generally uncomfortable being an oppositional figure toward the president or toward power here in Washington in general. What's interesting is with Trump, there's been a very mocking nature in the coverage of him, justifiably so. I mean, his administration has been a joke in a lot of regards for the first 3 months here. But there still is this pressure to get on board with something so that you can feel that hurrah moment getting behind the president. And that's what this strike in Syria offered these people who have been waiting for a moment to get behind the president. And the idea of calling a decision to launch military strikes presidential is just absurd. We saw Van Jones make this argument after Trump gave his address to Congress, and he acknowledged the widow of the SEAL who was killed in that raid, which by all reports was a raid that was not very well thought of and was botched. A president acting presidential doesn't just give his military free rein to go and launch these sort of attacks that cause needless death. And you see that same dynamic at work with this mother of all bombs that was dropped in Afghanistan. It looks pretty clear like Trump is just giving the military control to do all this sort of stuff. That doesn't seem presidential to me. There's been moments in history in which U.S. presidents have literally saved the world by overruling the advice of their generals at key junctures. I mean, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether it's the Korean War, wherever, there have been generals who have been wanting to use certain weapons on the battlefield, nuclear weapons, that presidents have said no. And I don't think that Trump, an incurious man that he is, who doesn't seem to care and has been known to delegate responsibility all his life, is going to be the guy at that critical moment. He's going to tell his generals, no, I think this is a terrible idea.
Ray, another instance where the media appears to be following the official narrative rather than doing its job independently, and that concerns these allegations that Russia meddled in the United States election. We've seen no proof of that, but we've seen media in this country, and some very well-known media, present this as known fact. This is fact.
Yeah.
There's no qualification that these are allegations or accusations. It's presented as this happened.
Yeah, it's assumed. It's flat fact, as we say in the trade, okay? The only problem is not true. There's no proof adduced to prove it, and it's mischievous, because I see what Trump did over the last week or so as a reaction to his being lumped together with the Kremlin. He's a Kremlin stooge, or he's Putin's friend, and all of a sudden they got to him. For 4 months he's been badgered by this, and here's a chance to prove that he's no friend to Putin. He'll charge Putin with conniving with the Syrians to do this attack, which we happen to know it was a mistake in terms of how this thing was released, okay? So I've been in this town 54 years now. I came down when John Kennedy was president and started working at the CIA. I've seen a lot of change, but there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes, and that is that we no longer have a free media in any sense of the word. That's big. You know, Thomas Jefferson, when he was asked if you had to choose between a free press and a government, which would you which would you choose? He said, no problem, a free press, because without a free press, the government can do whatever it wants to do. Bush wanted to seem presidential. The media bought it hook, line, and sinker, and hook, line, and sinker. And when you look at the evidence, well, the evidence is very clear from one of the best experts on chemical warfare techniques, Ted Postel, Professor Emeritus from MIT, who worked for the Chief of Naval Operations for 5 years. And, you know, he knows the government and he knows the science. And he's gone through with a fine-tooth comb this embarrassment of a paper, not signed by the Director of Central Intelligence, mind you, just one of these NSC papers that McMaster's had some political hacks to, okay? And when he takes that apart, he shows in technical detail that this was not something dropped from the air. This was something from the ground. Now, has that been in the New York Times? Well, they must have missed it, okay? But this is the guy that speaks with most authority on that, just as there were some people like Scott Ritter before Iraq spoke with incredible authority because he was the chief weapons inspector for the UN in Iraq. So the media is totally corrupt in my view. Exactly why? Well, some people say, well, the same corporations that control the media are profiteering on the war. I'm forced to admit that must be part of the answer, but it is corrupt.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons, probably, why the media has changed. What do you think, Sam, the change in the media? I mean, as Ray says, you know, it's serious when you say there's no free press.
Well, I think Ray nailed it. I think it's a huge part, corporations and the influence that they have over the media. The media is very consolidated at the moment, and it's a drive for ratings. To get the highest ratings, you have to get the most powerful people on your shows. That requires access, and to get access, you have to ask softball questions. You can't make these people look like fools on TV. So that leads to softball questions, and that whole thing I mentioned earlier about playing golf together, going to happy hours together. It causes everybody to be friends, and that's not the sort of adversarial relationship that breeds truth-telling.
Okay, on the one hand, Sam, we have this corporate ownership of the media, but to what extent did the events of 9/11 actually change the media as well?
Well, I mean, I guess they played an effect of kind of in a bunker mentality of us trying to say, as you mentioned at the beginning, the whole Bush saying you're either with us or you're against us. You see that very much in play when it comes to the Russia issue. I mean, the dominant narrative right now in Washington is that Russia hacked the election, that Trump and the Russians were working together. And if you criticize that or ask for more proof, then you are an agent of the Russian government. I think Ray brings up a good point, is the consequence of that thinking is you might be pushing a president who might not be all there, who we're all very concerned of, to military confrontation with Russia. And I'm not sure the people like Rachel Maddow, who are going on their show every single day and hyping this issue up, have considered what happens if they're wrong on this issue, and all they've done is
it also seems from the media that if you call anyone in Russia, you're talking to a Russian intelligence agent.
That's exactly, well, with respect to Rachel Maddow, I think the most telling comment that was made on her show was the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer of New York. He said, Rachel, I used to think Trump was a pretty smart guy, but he's made a real blunder. He's done something really stupid. And she says, what is that? He's taken on the CIA. And the CIA has 6 ways to Sunday.
That's right.
To get back at you. I thought he was a smart businessman, but he's done something very foolish. Now, if you were Rachel Maddow, if I were, we would have said, are you saying that the President of the United States should be afraid of the CIA? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah.
But no, she said, we're going to break, we're going to... Well, that's the kind of stuff that cries out for explanation. And indeed, if I were asked, was there Russian hacking? Of course, everyone hacks, okay? Was there Russian hacking that left telltale signs like Cyrillic? Okay, yes, there was hacking, but it was not Russian hacking. It was John Brennan, CIA hacking. And we have the proof in the pudding from the latest WikiLeaks release on Vault 7. It's right there. They have the tools to hack and make it appear that it's either Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Farsi, or Korean. I mean, it's right there. But is that in the New York Times? Is that in the Washington Post? No.
Talking about WikiLeaks, we just had the current CIA director, Mike Pompeo, say that he described it as a hostile intelligence service. I mean, that poses dangers for the entire media, doesn't it?
Well, if WikiLeaks is, then so is the New York Times, and so is the Washington Post. I mean, this is why the Obama administration has been unable to file charges or bring a case against Julian Assange, because they know that in doing so, you would be in a pretty thorny situation where you'd have to take on all the media outlets that have also relied on the documents that Chelsea Manning turned over, or whoever sources have turned over to WikiLeaks.